and he wants to make sure American interests are looked out for. And he also has a desire that we're not taken advantage of financially. I think it is true that our lack of clarity and sometimes hostility toward allies, our lack of clarity on our objectives and our goals and our values, and our hostility toward allies has led to us being viewed less favorably in the world. I think the deciding factor, if you're talking about what we're in right now, will be whether we recognize that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are united adversaries. It's good days. I feel the Trump administration remembers that. If they lose sight of that, then I think we won't have as successful an American century for the world and for America for the rest of this century.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Ia Meurmishvili, and it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Mr. Robert Doar. Mr. Doar is president of the American Enterprise Institute, one of the oldest and one of the most impactful and influential public policy think tanks in Washington, D.C. I am especially pleased to have Mr. Doar as a guest today because he does not usually comment on foreign policy, and today we will talk about foreign policy. Mr. Doar, thank you very much for making the time to talk to us today. It's a pleasure to see you.
It's great to be here.
You lead one of the, at least in my view, one of the most influential think tanks in Washington, D.C. You often advise administrations on policies, including this administration. Of course, at the start of the administration, there was much discussion about President Trump being isolationist, that America First policy was going to exclude America from the world, but that's not quite what's happened. How do you explain that, and how would you define the administration today?
Well, I think it's very clear that President Trump is willing to assert American power around the world. There's no doubt about that, and that would make him not an isolationist. And so the sort of stereotype or the easy characterization of him as retreating to Fortress America isn't really true. And it wasn't true in the first administration either, when he was willing in certain occasions to use American power around the world. The key thing is that he's very careful with it, and he wants to make sure American interests are looked out for. And he also has a desire that we're not taken advantage of financially, that we don't pay a bigger share of the bill or the cost or the casualties than any other part of the world that's also engaged. He wants it to be a fair deal. So, whether it's in Venezuela, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Iran, President Trump's willing to use American power to advance American interests and to look out for American allies, and even to project a power that looks to bring a more enlightened leadership to a particular country. I mean, he's clearly willing to do that. So the stereotype of him as being a very, very, adamant isolationist isn't really true. Now, he is complicated, and I'm happy to get into his complexities. But he's not an isolationist.
Let's start by comparing his approval ratings. That's one of the aspects, right, of the complexity. When President Trump came to power the second time, his approval ratings, both domestic politics as well as foreign policy, were quite high. I was looking at the numbers on Real Clear Politics average ratings, and basically on most issues, President Trump's ratings are much lower than they were before, and majority, in some cases, a large majority of the Americans disapproves of his foreign policy as well as domestic politics. So how do you explain what happened?
So the first thing to remember is he won a decisive victory in his second go-around, and he overcome enormous disadvantages and lots of opposition, and he ran against an incumbent party. It's an old story in American politics and in any self-governing democracy. People in power, as they expend political capital, as they make decisions, sometimes their support erodes. It doesn't always happen, but it does happen. It's not unusual. And President Trump, being a president who's not running for re-election and will not be on the ballot the next time, appears to be even less interested in worrying about poll numbers. And he says quite clearly, I'm not worried about that. Now, his party is facing a real challenge in the midterms as a result of this sense in America that they're not as pleased with him as they had been in the past. And there are a lot of factors in that, and it's going to be quite an interesting election coming up. But the idea that President Trump's popularity is down from when he was inaugurated or when he was elected is being something unique and unusual is just not correct. It happens to presidents all the time. That's what happens when you assert leadership and do strong things. And one thing about President Trump is he has been willing to take the mandate that he received with his decisive victory, where his party won both the House and the Senate, and do strong, big things. And that's going to lead to, the opposition sometimes being able to rally against him. I would say that as people outside of the United States look at the United States, they should recognize that President Trump doesn't represent all of America. He doesn't represent the heart of America. He's the president, but many people in America think differently than he does. I think more supportive of Ukraine than he has been. And so for people like me who are more supportive of Ukraine, that's something to build on and to try to lead and capitalize. But President Trump is a very unusual president. He's sui generis, as I say, and he's particularly unique in that he's not paying attention to polls. He's just trying to do what he thinks is right on any given day.
What do you think his factor is for the Republican Party? You mentioned the upcoming midterms this November.
So this is important history. President Trump has brought a lot of voters to the Republican Party, a lot of voters that have been decisive in Republican Party victories in the past. And I think that's still true. There are working class, high school educated, what you would have thought in the past, old line Democrats, labor Democrats, who have moved toward President Trump and the Republican Party, partly due to his leadership. And I think that's still there and still is an important factor in the race. In Republican or conservative politics, it's a coalition of people who are more similar perhaps to AEI scholars, who are very focused on less regulation and lower taxes and free markets and a global trading system, an immigration system that welcomes new people to our country. That group, very important part of the Republican coalition, along with a populist, more nationalist, more culturally conservative, for legitimate reasons, group of more working class Americans who feel strongly about faith, feel strongly about their families, feel strongly about the cultural qualities of America. They are also part of this Republican coalition. And the key for Republicans in a race against Democrats is, can they keep it together and get the turnout that they've gotten in the last election when President Trump was on the ballot to allow them to win victories. Political scholars here at AEI and others say that's an open question whether they can do that because that coalition's got to turn out. And it's unclear whether they will in the midterms. And so political prognosticators here at AEI and in other places are saying that it's a good chance the Democrats will take the House of Representatives and even some chance that they could win the Senate. And that will mean that we have, as we've had many times in our history, a president who's from one party and either one or both houses that's from a different party. That's how our system works. And I like it that way. I like it that we have this back and forth and that we have to go to the people every 2 years for the House and a third of the Senate, and that politics in America is, in that way, informed by the will of the people. That's why we're better, because we do go to the people and ask for their approval of our policies. And I mean we're in terms of all people that have elective politics and self-government as part of their system, which of course is not really true in Russia and not true in China or Iran or North Korea.
That's a very nice pivot to foreign policy now and America's role globally. President Trump has changed many things, globally as well as even domestically. Where do you think America stands right now as it comes to its role internationally?
We're the most prosperous country in the world in terms of GDP and size and growth of our economy, unquestionably. China is still far behind us in per capita GDP. Our military is still the strongest in the world in terms of its size. I think we've learned some lessons in the prosecuting of a war from Ukraine, but we're the strongest military force in the world. I think it is true that our lack of clarity and sometimes hostility toward allies, our lack of clarity on our objectives and our goals and our values, and our hostility toward allies has led to us being viewed less favorably in the world. And that, in certain situations, is a problem because we're going to need our allies at some point. And we have some work to do on that. I also feel that the United States is sort of clarion call for freedom, for self-government, that previous presidents, President Reagan most notably, but President Kennedy and others, stood for, has been diminished because President Trump's administration is not the greatest advancer of democratic values and freedom, which is unfortunate. They're more of a realpolitik and practical American national interests first, business interests first, over the self-determination or freedom of individual countries. I understand that, but that's reduced our reputation with freedom-loving people around the world, which concerns me. But, we've been through these things before, and hopefully, as time goes on, we'll come back to being willing to talk positively about the benefits of freedom and self-government over authoritarian regimes more aggressively and more openly than the current administration does. But, there are other aspects of his foreign policy that I think have been quite successful. In American politics or in any kind of democratic system, you get some positives and you have to deal with some negatives, and you just keep at it and keep working on it and try to guide the country in the direction you want to go.
You mentioned a lot of freedom, basically American values. Today's politics are, especially coming from President Trump, it seems like it's very transactional. And it's not just us talking about it. Allies, even adversaries think that. So let me ask you this question in a more pointing way. Do you think that American foreign policy still relies on American values at this point?
Well, again, I look at the long story. The piece I wrote recently and other pieces, I often refer to what President Kennedy called the long twilight struggle. And so I look at all of our presidents and our entire foreign policy over a history. There ebb and flows on this. But no one can look at the long history of the United States foreign policy since 1945 or since 1941 and not say that the United States has been a force for freedom and self-determination and independence for. So that's what I look at. Right now, we have a president who's putting a little different emphasis on different things, but when we tabulate up the amount of financial and military support to Ukraine for the entire period of the war, since the Russian invasion, I think that you're still going to find that the United States made a very significant contribution to that cause. And compared to our adversaries and our biggest challenger in the world, China, we were on the side of right and they weren't. I would say to Europeans and others, think of America more broadly than just our president or our current president at any time, whether it's President Trump or someone else. I've seen statistics before in other times when America has not been so great at treating its allies or has put out some messages that make people feel less comfortable about the United States. It's still the place people want to come to be a citizen and to start a life more than any other country. People can get, I can't, I don't, can get down on the United States because they don't like the most recent remarks of the current president, whether it's Trump or Biden or anyone. But I look at the bigger picture. That's what I particularly liked about Giorgia Meloni's comments over the weekend. She said a funny thing. She said, I don't understand why the American president feels the need to say these things that aren't correct. And what she did there, she didn't say Donald Trump. She made the statement that almost sounded like, I expect more from the American president because I have greater faith in the United States. And I like that. I like that tone, and I think that's the tone that Europe should take.
You mentioned what President Trump at times would say, how the world reacts to it. One of the recent statements, actually repeated statements, was that the United States has no vital stake in Ukraine. Would you agree with that statement?
Our scholars don't agree with that. We think that the United States' interests in Ukraine relate not only to our desire to support free and independent nations, but also that if Russia is successful there, they will perpetuate further damage to other countries that will undermine the feeling of in a world that is then going to lead costs to the United States. I should say that I'm not a foreign policy expert, and you need to introduce me in that way, but I represent an institution that has many foreign policy experts. And I do think that when American experts say that the war in Ukraine is about us, because if after they get Ukraine, they're going to come after us, or they're going to go to every other country in Europe. That line has been used in America with American voters in many other contexts and for a long time. And I would say, just as someone who observes political opinion, it doesn't actually work that well. In my own judgment, you can get further with them by saying that the United States should stand up for nations fighting for freedom because it's the right thing to do. Then you can saying, if we don't fight Russia and Ukraine, your living standards are going to drop. I don't think they buy that. I think they don't think it's true.
You were recently in Ukraine. On your first trip to Ukraine, after seeing news coming out of that war for 4 years, what was your impression being there, meeting?
Well, I was very impressed by the people of Ukraine. I was very impressed by the people of Moldova and the leadership of both Moldova and of Ukraine, in that they were in a real battle with a power that was stronger and bigger and had more people. And they were fighting for freedom, and they were persevering, and they were being resilient. I think they are tired. I was also very impressed with in Odessa or in Kyiv or in between. That part of the country seems unaffected. People were going about their business in a positive way. So I was very taken by that. I also happened to be at a conference that involved competing politicians in the Ukrainian government and legislature, competing politicians with each other and with President Zelensky. And then I went to a conference in Kyiv where, again, I was exposed to, the hurly-burly of a country that has people that are jostling for power in an open and free way. And I like that. I thought that was great. I don't think that sort of thing is what I would see if I went to Moscow. And that's why I identify with Ukraine in their battle. So I was very, very impressed.
If you were advising President Trump, what would your advice be? I understand your point about you not being the foreign policy person per se. What would be your advice to him related to Ukraine?
I would tell him, as our scholars have told him, that he should support them with both military and financial help. He should also insist that Europe support them as well and increase their spending on defense to closer to 5%. And I would tell him that he should condemn the actions of Vladimir Putin.
I've heard your comments previously where you said that some of the Republicans have a differing opinion from President Trump as it comes to Russia and President Putin. Walk us through that. What's that difference?
It's not hard to walk through. You go over and you look at the congressional record, or you study the remarks of the vast, I would say, more than the majority of the Republican caucus in the Senate. Certainly, same with Democrats. And their rhetoric about President Putin and the invasion of Ukraine is much stronger. But they're not president. They can say it, and they can feel it, and they can try to persuade him, but he's in charge. And so you have to respect that. Or he has the role in foreign policy, which we give to the president, which is quite strong. But to say that because President Trump isn't quite as good on this issue as you'd like him to be, therefore all Republicans or all members of Congress are lost and are not with you is just not factually correct.
We have a NATO summit coming up in Ankara. President Trump, I believe, is going to attend it. Well, what are the messages that you would like to see coming out from the White House, from President Trump at that summit? And how do you think the Europeans should respond to it? What do you think Europeans should deliver at the summit?
Well, that's a tricky one. NATO is a harder issue, especially if you're thinking about President Trump's attitude. Here's one thing I have thought. It seems to me that it's perfectly legitimate to say it's 2026 now. Should we really have the same security apparatus and setup that we created in 1947? I mean, the president and his people have a point in saying that that was set up when we were facing a much different challenge. And the countries of Europe, France, Germany, and others, were in much different circumstance and situation. And of course, the USSR was much different. The idea that we shouldn't be rethinking or thinking anew, as President Lincoln would say, how we should set up our various responses to difficult public policy challenges, to me is silly. The rhetoric that says it's been this way for all this time and it's been great, therefore we should keep it as it is, that's not enough to make the case. We need to come up with something new for this different time.
Imagine looking back at this time, very pivotal moment in the U.S. History and the global history, power realignment globally. What do you think we'll consider as the point that sort of either makes or breaks another American century? There are times when
that's a very big question. That's a much bigger question than just the situation in Eastern Europe. So I have to think about that a little bit. Rhetoric about the American century is fraught with all kinds of issues that I'd rather not mention. I will just say that for the United States to remain a leading power in the world and a force for freedom and independence, it needs to continue to shoulder and be willing to shoulder that responsibility, not alone, but in a leading way. And as I've mentioned before, over the long haul, I think it's hard to argue that the United States has not done its part. And I think the deciding factor, if you're talking about what we're in right now, will be whether we recognize that China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran are united adversaries against freedom and against free markets and free people and self-government. It's good days. I feel the Trump administration remembers that. And we need to just keep reminding them. If they lose sight of that, then I think we won't have as successful an American century for the world and for America for the rest of this century.
You just watched an interview with Robert Doar, president of the American Enterprise Institute. If you like our interviews, do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on social media wherever you are on social media. Thanks for watching and see you next time.